This episode of the Curious About Cannabis podcast is brought to you by you, our dedicated listeners and supporters. Thanks to your continued listening, sharing, and donations, we've been able to continue the show free from third-party advertisers and sponsors. So, thank you. And if you'd like to learn about other ways you can support the show, visit patreon.com/curiousaboutcannabis.
My name is Elise Mcdonough. I'm a cannabis cookbook author and currently the brand manager for Satori Confections in California.
The Curious About Cannabis podcast is produced by Natural Learning Enterprises, a mission-driven company dedicated to enhancing critical thinking skills and public scientific literacy about life in the natural world. If you like Curious About Cannabis, consider checking out some of these other learning initiatives by Natural Learning Enterprises.
Come on, Molly! It'll be an adventure! Phoebe called out as she followed Brother Toadstool. Brother Toadstool led Phoebe and Molly into a tunnel that went deep down into the ground. As they climbed into the tunnel, they found themselves getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
Our new children's book, A Toadstool's Treasures, takes young readers on an adventure into the fun and fascinating world of fungi. Learn more and find mycology-related learning resources, games, and lesson plans for teachers and homeschooling families at toadstoolstreasures.com. Biodiversity loss due to habitat loss and fragmentation is rapidly increasing around the world with devastating consequences. Learn how you can help contribute to native habitat corridors in your community and reconnect with your wild neighbors at gardenwild.org. Oregon recently became the first state in the United States to legalize the medical use of psilocybin. As cities all over the country begin to decriminalize the use of entheogenic plants and fungi, it's time to have a serious discussion about psychedelics. The Serious About Psychedelics limited series podcast is coming soon. Learn more at seriousaboutpsychedelics.com. You can learn more about Natural Learning Enterprises at naturaledu.com. And now, back to the show. Hey everybody, this is Jason Wilson with the Curious About Cannabis podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in once again. So today I'm really excited to get to talk all about edibles with Elise Mcdonough, who has written multiple cannabis cookbooks and just has a ton of information to share. Thanks so much, Elise, for being willing to come on the podcast today.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, totally. I don't think I've ever really talked about edibles on the podcast before, so this will be kind of a really good breath of fresh air, I think, for a lot of people listening that have questions about this area. And for those that aren't already familiar with some of your work, because you've done not just the publishing of the cookbooks, but you've done writing kind of all over the place for years. Do you mind sharing a little bit with our listeners, a little bit about your background and how you found yourself caught up in the world of cannabis edibles?
Yeah, I got started with edibles working at High Times. So I got a job at High Times right out of college, which was kind of like winning the lottery.
Yeah.
It was definitely like a dream job for me. And so I worked there for 15 years. I became their first ever edibles editor, and I wrote the official High Times Cannabis Cookbook. So that really solidified my position as, a person of note in the cannabis edible space. And the cookbook came out in 2012. So it was right at the start of this burgeoning trend towards cannabis cookbooks, which have become a genre unto themselves. So that's how I got started. And since leaving High Times, I've authored the Bon Appetit cookbook and have gone on to have many articles published in Leafly and Cannabis Now. And I currently work as a brand manager at Canna, which is California's largest cannabis manufacturer. And I primarily work on confections, including our Satori chocolate brand.
That's really cool. And does your interest for for cooking and food. Is that something that you've always kind of had a passion for, even as as a child, or is that something that came about later with cannabis?
Yeah, I really got interested in cooking when I became a vegetarian. I was
Hmm.
kind of like a hippie teenager, and I decided I wanted to be a vegetarian when I was 15. And my mom is, super nice lady. She's great. And she said, well, you can eat whatever you want, but I'm not going to cook you special food. So that really prompted me to start cooking for myself more, which I continued when I went to New York City for college. I got really into cooking and learning about all kinds of different diets. I took some classes on nights and weekends at the Natural Gourmet Institute. So, yeah, taking classes at the Natural Gourmet Institute really solidified my basic knowledge. And I just always really enjoyed cooking, and adding the cannabis was just a natural next step.
Totally. And how did that start out for you? What were some of the first things that you tried to cook with cannabis?
Oh, wow. We started a lot with like pie crusts and like
Hmm.
pumpkin pie. That was something that I would make. And we would recreate recipes that were sent into High Times so that we could take photos. So that helped me like broaden my horizons. I made a lot of different things that maybe Chef Raw would have sent in a recipe, or Ashley Boudreau was a contributor that we worked with for a long time. And she's in New Orleans. So she would send a lot of,
Yeah.
Cajun and Creole type recipes that were infused. So starting off with stuff like that, usually a lot of pretty simple things, mastering the basics of, the butter and infusing into fats and coconut oil. And then, yeah, making a lot of cookies, making a lot of basic stuff. I lived in New York City at the time, and I had a super small kitchen. So, yeah, we would just make what we could. And among the staff at High Times, we would take turns bringing in different infused treats every Friday that we would share with each other. And that was a tradition called Space Cake Friday. Yeah, so a lot of good times just making brownies and cookies, and, baklava was a favorite.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah.
Nice. And what did you, through that period of mastering some of those basics, like for instance, you mentioned the butter, what did you learn through that process? Like, what does it take to make a good cannabis infused butter?
This is something that we worked on for High Times in a video called the Ultimate Canna Butter Experiment. And it was super interesting to me because I was working all of these events, going to the Cannabis Cup, Seattle Hemp Fest, standing behind a booth. People will always come up to you and tell you stories. And I would get a lot of tips about, this is the best way you make
Of
canna
course.
butter. You do it on the full moon, and you add a tablespoon of water every hour, and you stir it for 24 hours nonstop. Like you hear the wildest things.
Hmm.
And everybody would always say, well, my method is the best way. And, so basically I decided to test out several different methods of making canna butter using the same weed, the same kind of butter, the same quantities, 4 different methods. And then we had the results analyzed by SC Labs in Santa Cruz to see if there really was, an efficient way better than the others. So we uncovered some really interesting things. And basically, what I tell people about infusions is that there is a way to do it with the equipment that you have on hand. Like, you don't have
Mm.
to go out and buy special gadgets or gear to make a cannabis infusion at home. So usually when people ask me for advice, I start by asking, what's their skill level? What kind of equipment do they have at home? And what are they trying to make with the butter? Because that can affect, the kind of concentrations
Mm.
that you'll want to achieve. Do you want just to infuse a little bit of cannabis in a lot of butter? Do you want to infuse a lot of cannabis into a small amount of butter? So there's a great many considerations. But yeah, I definitely encourage people to check out the Ultimate Canna Butter Experiment. There's a really cool method in there that I like a lot from Jeff, the 420 chef. And he uses a French press to do the
Oh,
infusion, which is pretty convenient, pretty ingenious. And then the Bon Appetit method is the mason jar method, which I also like because you can infuse several different fats simultaneously. Each fat goes into a mason jar with the cannabis. you close the jar, you put it into just some simmering water, and that will infuse the fat inside the jar. And that's helpful if you're trying to cut down on the odor of cannabis in your home, or if you live in an
Ah,
apartment building or something like that. It's a little more stealthy. So there's a million different ways to make canna butter, and they all work. And that's what's important, is like, if you just want a method that will get you high, it's as simple as just, throwing some weed and some butter in a crock pot and letting it simmer for at least an hour and then straining it. Like, that is the most basic.
yeah, totally. And when you were playing around with all of this, let's say going back to some of the first times that you started cooking with cannabis, did you run into the smell issue particularly is something that I'm thinking about. Did you have moments of making your entire place just smell incredibly like cannabis everywhere?
Oh yeah, you could smell it when you walked in the front door. And I lived in like a fifth floor walk up in Manhattan with, like, a pretty small building with a few other neighbors, and they all knew about us. And sometimes we would try to cook other like really pungent things at the
Hmm.
same time, like, caramelize some onions, saute some garlic, like get some other smells up in the mix so it doesn't seem to be too obvious what you're doing. But yeah, there's really no covering it up unless you use a method specifically designed to keep the smells inside.
Yeah, and that actually leads to another thing that I've been curious to talk to you about for a while is the what are some of the complementary smells and tastes that you find really partner with cannabis well?
Well, cannabis, if you're working with cannabis flower or buds,
Hmm.
it's so herbaceous that it's really grassy, and that's because of
Hmm.
the chlorophyll inside. That is the very characteristic flavor of cannabis that a lot of people don't like. If you try to put it in baked goods or in cookies, it's very noticeable. I find that if you're working in savory applications, the flavor of the flower actually works better. You can use it
Hmm.
more like an herb. It works well in recipes where there's other herbs, like pesto or chimichurri. That's a really good application for cannabis flower. I personally like to cook with hash, which I feel is better suited for dessert recipes usually. Like, the
Hmm.
hash has a really nice earthy flavor on its own. And, you know, it works well in any kind of recipe where you're using cinnamon or nutmeg or
Hmm.
cloves. Hash really complements those kind of spices. I like to use ice water hash or just unpressed beef for stuff like that. But I find it, yeah, if you're cooking with cannabis flower, traditionally people would use flavors like peanut butter or chocolate to kind of
Hmm.
cover it up. That's part of the reason why brownies are so popular.
Right.
If you're cooking like lighter, more delicate desserts, the flavor is just overwhelming. Um, so you don't really want to use cannabis flower to infuse like a lemon meringue pie. You want to use it for like a pecan pie if you have to.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I'm just imagining what a cannabis flavored lemon meringue pie would taste like. Uh,
Well, that's what we got into in the Bong Appetit book, like, very in depth, was pairing the flavors of the cannabis with different cuisines, using it in in a way to heighten the flavors of the
mhm.
entire dish, rather than it just being something that you're trying to cover up.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, kind of find its proper place within the culinary toolbox. I think that's really good. And while you were going through this process, what lessons did you learn as far as things that maybe you should never do when you're cooking with cannabis?
The main thing is that you don't want to let the infusion go too long because it'll get bitter. And that
Oh,
goes
okay.
against like some of the traditional wisdom, is that you have to do this really long infusion time. And when you do that, the plant matter is just breaking down so completely and getting really crispy that like a bitterness will come out in your infusion. You really don't have to do it any
Interesting.
longer than 45 minutes to an hour. And the lower the temperature that you use, the less likely you are to get any kind of like burnt taste. That's also a consideration if you want to decarb your cannabis before infusing it.
Hmm.
if you want to maximize every little milligram of THC, you definitely want to decarb first and then do the infusion. And so decarb, that just means that you're converting all of the acidic THC that's
Hmm.
present in the raw plant or the dried flower into the psychedelic version of THC. And so if you absolutely want to maximize that, decarb is a good step, but it toasts the flower, so it tastes kind of toasty. So a lot of times I like to skip the decarb step, and I feel like I get a better flavor that way, at least for my personal taste.
Yeah, that makes sense, and it touches on another thing that I was interested to explore, which is the role that the terpene fraction of the cannabis flower might play into all of this. And like you were saying, if you decarb it, obviously you're going to be purging, all of those aromatic components out, and they form new things, and they tend to, yeah, not smell too great or taste great. Um, how if at all, how do terpenes play into how you think about using particularly herbal cannabis or even extracts, I guess, if they're terpene rich, when you're making things that you're not decarbing?
Yeah, if you want to use terpenes, you have to do it in a cold preparation because they're
Hmm.
so volatile. They'll evaporate when the heat is applied. So they're kind of preserving terpenes is at cross purposes with maximizing THC. So we talk about this a lot in the Bong Appetit cookbook, and we give some suggestions as to like how you can use terpenes in a cold preparation. Um, and what I really like about the flavor pairings of cannabis and how you can maximize the pairing cannabis strains with dishes, like that's really where we
Yeah.
look at the terpenes. Like if you're suppose you're creating a menu and you want to have a progression of paired strains along with each course, then you would look at the terpenes in each strain that you're smoking and attempt to match it with the flavors in the dish. And this is something that I experienced for the first time with Corinne Carroll from the Cannasaurus series. She's the chef there, and I love her method of doing the joint progression. That you start out with like a really like a suppose you start with a sativa that's very lemony, and you would pair that with suppose like a ceviche or something that has a lot of citrus
Mhm.
flavors to it. And then as the courses get more rich, the
Ah, yeah.
cannabis also gets richer and more flavorful till at the end of the night you're having a steak with a chimichurri sauce and some red wine, and you would pair that with like a really deep, flavorful strain of something like sour diesel or like a really gassy, savory strain like GMO.
Yeah, that's pretty cool to think about it that way, of changing your terpene profile as the courses progress. That's something I hadn't considered. That's pretty interesting.
I
Eh,
like it because it's a parallel to wine and how you
Yeah.
pair wine
Hmm.
with meals. It makes it easier for people to understand how cannabis can be this culinary enhancer. And also with terpenes, I think there's a lot of fun things that you can do with cocktails, and I like to see
Hmm.
the mixologists who are playing around in that world.
Yeah, yeah. There's so much to do, especially given that essential oils are already used in cocktails to different degrees anyway, and other plants and mint plants and different things. So yeah, that's a whole other world. It seems like, to explore, all sorts of recipes to be had there. And when people get into edibles, one thing that's really common is there's kind of an intimidation factor, particularly for folks that might be more naive, that haven't taken edibles before or very much, or they don't use cannabis very much, and so edibles can be very intimidating because they produce effects that are different than if you smoke or anything else, because of the way the liver processes everything. So do you have any advice for people that might be feeling that intimidation about trying cannabis edibles, of how to um, basically try to ensure that they have the best experience possible, that they don't take too much, and that sort of thing?
Absolutely. And this is the cornerstone of the work that we do at Satori Chocolates in my day-to-day education of our customer base. We let everybody know that it's important to go low and slow, which basically means starting with a very low dose, making sure that you wait the full 2 hours for the effects to fully manifest before you ingest any more cannabis infused food. So yes, we encourage people to start with, a 2 milligram blueberry or, a 3 milligram strawberry and see how that makes them feel and then work their way up from there. And the state recommends that you limit your dosing to 10 milligrams, which for some people can be quite a lot.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, and that's kind of one of the new things about the market these days is that there's a lot of microdosed products because we want new users to have a good first experience. And the way that the markets used to be before it was regulated, there were a lot of things out there that were just very, very strong, and people
Yeah.
would literally bite off more than they could chew. When you're looking at a brownie that has 500 milligrams and you don't know how much of it you're supposed to eat. So that's one
Yeah.
thing that the regulations have done that's been successful is really make the products much safer for people who are new to using cannabis.
Yeah, I remember there was a conference I went to years ago now, but I remember it was back when I was working in the cannabis testing space, and we had a booth and everything. And there was a lady that came up to us that brought her like 80-year-old mother who was hooked up to oxygen, and she wanted to try cannabis edible, and she was like, "Take a look at this product my mom has, and let me know, what to think about it." And she showed it to me, and it was a candy bar that was like yeah, it was like 500 milligrams or 400 milligrams or something. And I was like, oh my gosh. It's like I mean, this is someone who's very cannabis naive. And they said maybe break it in half. And I was like, maybe like by a lot more than a half, maybe by like a 30th. Um, but it was something that was very alarming back then before legalization and before there were testing rules, before any of that. Yeah, it was common to see candy bars, 500 milligrams, 1,000 milligrams floating around. And this touches on another thing that I wanted to get your perspective on, which is how the edibles market has evolved since those times to today and kind of where it seems to be headed.
Yeah, yeah. I used to judge edibles for the Cannabis Cup. And so I saw all kinds of things throughout the years. And the most dangerous were the things that weren't labeled at
Yeah,
all, or it
yeah,
wasn't very clear that there was cannabis in it. And I'm not saying dangerous in the sense that, like, it's not going to hurt you. It's completely non toxic, but it can be a negative experience for people and it
and
can make them,
uncomfortable.
yeah, and it can make them never want to try it again.
Yeah.
So that's primarily what we're concerned about. We want people to have good experiences with cannabis. And so, yes, in the unregulated era, hopefully they would list, allergen warnings and a sense of how strong it is. If it's
Mhm.
not lab tested necessarily, maybe it says 1x or double X, double strength, but you don't really know what's being doubled.
Compared to what?
Yeah, exactly. Compared to what? So that's the biggest change that I've seen is that the products are obviously, regulated very tightly, much more standardized, much better quality controls. Um, on the flip side, for medical patients, it has gotten harder to find high dose products, which a lot of
Mhm.
patients who are seeking to replace pharmaceuticals really rely on those high dose products. And nowadays, you can only get that in like a capsule or tablet format. Um, so there's definitely been some downsides for medical patients, but there's been a lot of upsides for the average consumer who wants to try edibles and who wants to feel a safe and secure experience, but also one that's predictable and repeatable from one time to the next. Um, so that's kind of the biggest differences I see. The diversity of products that you
Mhm.
used to be able to get has greatly winnowed down to now, gummies and chocolates and basic baked goods are pretty much the bulk of the edibles market. There's some very interesting things going on with drinks and teas that I think
Yeah, I've
is very
noticed that.
cool. Yeah. But the old school days of just getting ice creams and beef jerkies and pickles and juice and just like wild stuff has been all eliminated by the regulations. But you can still make those kind of things at home, which I think is opening up new worlds for the home cooks.
And what is it about the regulations that has driven some of those products out?
Mostly it's there's a prohibition on using dairy or anything that has to be held at a
Ah,
refrigerated temperature. So it's
mm-hmm.
like you can use dairy as an ingredient in a baked good that holds stable at room temp, but you can't have ice creams or anything that has to be kept
I see.
refrigerated or frozen. That's basically because they can't call in the FDA to inspect these facilities because it's state legal, not
Hmm.
federally, the Federal
Right.
Department of Agriculture or the USDA. So that's basically why the restrictions are on meat and dairy ingredients. I remember in Michigan one year we got cannabis-infused smoked salmon, and it was awesome. It was
Wow.
so good, but like, yeah, you can't really regulate the sale of that.
Yeah, and from my perspective, from the analytical chemistry side, one thing that we always struggled with was some products, are relatively straightforward to test as far as, things like butters, infused olive oils, other infused vegetable oils, simple things that are relatively homogeneous. Those would be pretty easy. Then you get into um, things like gummies, where you're starting to deal with some complex chemistry in the products themselves that make it hard to separate out the cannabinoids. And then when you get into even more complex products, it really gets challenging. And we had people that like tried to bring us pizza one time to test, and we're like we're just not not equipped to try to deconstruct a pizza. Nor did we ever
Yeah.
think that we should be. And so another thing that I've thought is potentially just the some of those challenges I assume probably makes producers frustrated. It's hard to get accurate results on certain types of products, and some the labs just won't touch at all. And so I kind of wondered if that was also pushing some of those things, because I always thought back then that it's like surely the all of these different products, surely it'll dwindle down to some basic things, and sure enough, it seems like it has. And one thing I remember that was a problem is like for beef jerky that relied on cannabinoids to essentially be added, kind of like a salt on the outside of the beef jerky. It would usually kind of come off, flake off, or whatever, gather in the packaging. I remember producers struggling with that. And so that touches on something I wanted to ask you, which is, are there certain foods that are not favorable to try to integrate cannabis with at all?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. So obviously, cannabis loves fat.
Hmm.
Traditional recipes are heavily reliant upon the cannabinoids binding to the lipid molecules and being digested. And like the marriage of the cannabinoids and the fats is
Hmm.
what makes it more bioavailable in your body. And so traditionally, yeah, the products would be infused with either a cannabis butter or coconut oil or some kind of fat. Without that fat, when you're looking at things like gummies or drinks, then
Hmm.
you get into this new modern era of cannabis science and the different emulsion techniques. And that's something that's been very cool to learn more about as I've been at CannaCraft, making the beverages, making the gummies, making them effective. It requires a level of science that you can't just do in a home kitchen. Um, so yeah, obviously, I think that things like sodas are pretty hard to infuse if you don't have a PhD and the benefit of a professional manufacturing facility to do that kind of stuff. A lot of the early drinks that I remember seeing, if you did a stability test on it and just let it sit in your fridge for a
Hmm.
month, eventually all the hash oil congeals at the
Yep.
top of the liquid. So yeah, shelf stability is something that people didn't really use to test. They would just kind of mix it up and put it out there and see how it does. And that's, with the drinks, obviously, yeah, your emulsion will completely fall apart after a while. Um, but yeah, those are the challenges, and that's the kind of the new frontier is replacing alcohol or giving people more of a choice and a substitution
Hmm.
by having these, sessionable beverages. I think is very cool.
Yeah, for sure. I remember reading that one of the challenges with aluminum cans is that the lining in the cans was lipophilic, and so cannabinoids would also like soak into that lining and basically leach out of the drink over time. So just the potency, as it sat there, would continue to go down. And it's the whole, like we said before, the whole world of cannabis infused drinks is um, uh, it presents very interesting problems. And you also raised another thing I wanted to ask you about, which is CannaCraft itself. I mean, they've been a huge player, like you said, in the cannabis scene in California for a long time. Care by Design, all sorts of different things that they've done. How did you cross paths with CannaCraft?
Yeah, CannaCraft is definitely a leader in the industry and a company that I had been following for a long time. I greatly admire the work of people like Martin Lee and
Yeah.
Tiffany Devitt, who originally developed Care by Design and pioneered the CBD ratio formulations, as well as people like Dennis Hunter and Ned Fussell, who are the co founders and real OGs in the cannabis industry who have been around for a long time. And Dennis went to federal prison, and so they greatly understand that it's a movement before it's a business, but they've been able to successfully transition into the legal regulated space, primarily because they were such pioneers. But yeah, I got involved with CannaCraft, and I know some people over there, and it really just, I was very happy to be able to join the organization because I care about that kind of authenticity, and it's
Yeah.
been really fun over there. It's everyone's really great, and I just learn a ton. And there's so many talented people on staff.
Yeah, and what are they? Can you describe a little bit about the confections that they make and some of the products that you're getting to work with currently?
Yeah, so I work with Chef Matt Kolzicki. He's our edible production manager, and so he makes all the chocolate products and does a lot of our R&D on new confections. And so we have a great time brainstorming new and different products. And he also makes all the gummies for Care by Design and ABX. And so, yeah, we're always developing new things, and it really has like a Willy Wonka vibe to it.
Totally. Yeah.
And so, and the Satori line, something that we're very excited about is using, you know, nano emulsion in our chocolate so that it creates a fast acting effect.
Hmm.
And we're introducing new fast acting chocolate bars that I'm very excited about. And we're pairing sustainably sourced cacao from Latin America, from farmer co ops, with this cutting edge cannabinoid science to bring you a chocolate bar that tastes amazing without a hint of cannabis flavor, but you'll feel the effects much faster than traditional edibles. And like that's the kind of stuff that I am so excited to do at CannaCraft, where it's really understanding the quality ingredients, the chef driven flavors, and the great taste, but also being able to work with a PhD in cannabinoid science and molecular biology, um, to make sure that people are feeling this really awesome effect from the cannabis itself. It's not just about
Yeah.
the food and how it tastes; it's about how it makes you feel.
Right. And this pursuit of a fast acting edible is one that the market has sort of been demanding for a long time because people would like to be able to, like you said, go somewhere socially, be able to have an alternative to alcohol or a companion, and be able to enjoy it and have the effects come on while you're actually having your social interactions, not 2 hours later, when you've gotten home and you're ready to go to sleep and I made a mistake and now it's kicking in and I'm going to be awake for a while. Well, I guess it depends. Some people go straight to sleep, but it's an interesting pursuit, and it's cool to hear that that's kind of where your mind's headed. And I'm interested to see how some of these nano emulsified products, um, like pharmacologically, I'm really interested to understand the bioavailability dynamics there, because it could potentially allow people to get more effect from a lower dose as well, and essentially have everything be more efficient.
Got a big truck. Hold on.
No worries, that was perfect timing too.
Yeah, the thing with the fast acting edibles is that it really goes back to the user experience and optimizing it for people who are new to cannabis.
Mhm.
When you have a fast acting edible and you feel the effects much more quickly, it eliminates the most common mistake that we see with negative experiences, which is the person eats a bite of a cookie, they wait maybe a half hour, 45 minutes. It's not working. I don't feel it. So then they eat more. And then 2 hours later, they're uncomfortably high because they inadvertently ingested too much because they got impatient. It's hard to
Yeah.
wait for the 2 hours. So yeah, when it comes on much more quickly, then the user is able to titrate and say, well, I will have a little bit more. I do want to keep this going and at a pace that's comfortable for them. And we just had an article come out in Playboy talking about how fast acting edibles are perfect for a quickie, which was pretty sexy stuff, but it was very cool. And it talks about how having that shorter onset time
Mm-hmm.
makes it easier to set a romantic mood. You're not guessing or you're
Yep.
not waiting for too long.
Yeah, just that ability to plan in general is so nice because a 2 hour window, and it's so variable depending on how much have you eaten throughout the day and what are you eating it with, and there's so many different things that tie into that time of onset, and sometimes it can be as quick as 30 minutes or so, but in other times 2 hours or more. So yeah, that ability, that empowerment to say, all right, we're gonna plan an activity, and things are gonna go relatively the way we expect, um, is really great. And are there any unique challenges to working with nano emulsified cannabinoids?
I'd love to introduce you to our head of new product development is Matt Elms, PhD. He's a great guy.
Yeah, great.
The challenge is you definitely have to test everything out very thoroughly.
Mm-hmm.
So we do a lot of R&D. It takes a long time. We have to be able to substantiate every marketing claim that we
Yeah.
make. So yeah, we definitely delve into the science and we do as much research as we possibly can. And yeah, things like the stability testing and just making sure that everything holds up over time. So yeah, we do a lot of testing before we debut any new products just to make sure that all the details have been worked out. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of the biggest challenge is that you're trying something completely new. And like you mentioned with the cans, nobody thought about
Yeah.
that until it happened. Um, so yeah, as far as the challenges of the emulsification, it's just a work in progress and it gets better all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And something I just thought about that I think would be good to talk about, kind of going back to, we've sort of gone into the high tech, and now to go back to the low tech, thinking about people in their homes and their home kitchens and things. There's so many different types of carriers that people could use. Like, and we've mentioned a lot of them, from butter to MCT oil to different vegetable oils, etc. Um, do you have recommendations for people on types of carriers that tend to be more shelf stable, that tend to be more favorable, versus others? Because, for instance, I know from working in the lab that, like, things that were usually in hemp seed oil often went rancid a lot faster than things that were in other types of carriers. So I know there's a gradient of shelf stability as well as flavors and other issues. So can you just speak to that a little bit and give some home cooks some potential recommendations on things that they should focus on, and maybe certain carriers that are better ignored?
Yeah, I did some work around this when I was at High Times, and we made a video about the different kinds of fats and like a
Mhm.
similar experiment where we infused the same kind of cannabis into many different kinds of fats and oils, and then we took it to the lab, and we didn't see, a tremendous amount of variation, but it did seem like the saturated fats that are solid at room temp,
Mhm.
butter, coconut oil, bacon fat, those things seem to pick up a little bit more THC compared to fats that are liquid, like olive
Mm.
oil, grapeseed oil. Whatever you infuse, you should refrigerate it in general, unless you're using it right away, and that will help preserve those oils and keep them from going rancid. You definitely don't want stuff to be exposed to sunlight or excessive oxygen. You want it to be kept airtight. And if you're not going to use your infused fat right away, you can freeze it. So it's definitely important for people to realize that once you've infused the cannabis in there, especially with butter, it can get moldy faster than like regular butter would.
Yeah.
So once you've made essentially a compound butter, if you're not using it within 5 days, you should probably freeze it, and then it'll stay good in your freezer for a couple months.
Nice. Yeah, that's super helpful. One thing I wanted to change gears a little bit away from the edibles, because I know you have an extensive background in the medical community in California. You used to work with WHAM, isn't that right? Or you volunteered with WHAM back in the day, isn't that right?
Yeah, that's a big reason why I chose to live in Santa Cruz. I moved
Hmm.
to California in 2010 from New York City, and ended up in Santa Cruz because I had met Mike and Valerie Corral from WHAM. I met them at the Cannabis Cup in Amsterdam, and we really got to hang out and spend a lot of time with each other. And I was really impressed with what they were doing. And so, yeah, I started volunteering with WHAM in 2010. We would go up for garden days on the weekends and work all day tending the plants and watering them and leafing them. And patients would go up there and make their own capsules, and they would trim flower. And it was just a really beautiful experience and a wonderful organization. And I learned so much, coming from New York and working at High Times. I understood academically about medical marijuana.
Hmm.
I had read a lot about it, but coming to Santa Cruz and the WHAM Collective, you meet dozens of people who tell you their stories and say that I was given 6 months to live, and here I am 5 years later, and it's all because of cannabis. It's very powerful, and WHAM is continuing into this new era. It's taken them a little while to transition, and it's taken a
Hmm.
while for the laws to catch up. But it is possible to do compassionate care and donations again in California. And so WHAM
Nice.
has relaunched as WHAM Phytotherapies,
Oh,
and
that's exciting.
they've brought a brand of flower to market, and they're working towards being able to build a community center that will be open to the public in Santa Cruz. Once we can do in person hanging out again.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, everybody should definitely check out WHAM, and I wish them nothing but success.
Yeah, that's so cool. I had no idea they were reviving. I mean, I'm originally from the Southeast, and when I grew up, studying cannabis and looking at organizations out west to understand what all was going on, I remember, at length following WHAM and seeing that model that they had put together and patient stories and everything. And so even, like 2,000 miles away, that organization was very inspiring, and so I thought it was really cool when I saw in one of your bios that you worked with them. And are there any patient stories in particular that really kind of grabbed your heart while you were there, that kind of furthered that passion that was building?
Oh, so many people, so many good friends,
Yeah.
people like Kathy Rock and Diane and Gloria, and just like so many people that they really brightened my life. Especially Kathy Rock. She became a really good friend of mine, and just a beautiful older woman, long white hair. She always wore tie dyes. She really loved the Dead. Yeah, just so many great active seniors that we made friends with throughout the years. And it's tough because you're in this organization and you realize that
Hmm.
like a lot of your friends are going to pass away.
Hmm.
And Valerie Corral, who is the co-founder of WHAM, she does a lot of death midwifery, is what they call it.
Hmm.
And she has an
Yeah.
organization called Rada Kuho, which is all about planning how to transition um, in the most graceful and beautiful way possible. So that's also something that I learned a lot about from Valerie, and that I really admire about her, is that she's been present for the deaths of dozens and dozens of
Gosh,
people, and she
yeah,
helps them through that and helps their families as well.
that's such a special sort of I don't know, almost a um, I don't know what the word would be, like an ordination or something, to have to be in that role and learn how to be with people through their last moments and how to assist their loved ones through all those transitions. That's such a important and heavy responsibility. Um, but it's true. I mean, when we zoom out of the cannabis industry a bit and we start to refocus on the patients and to think about the what people are going through that are using this plant for very serious issues. I remember when I worked in the lab before testing rules were really implemented, a lot of the testing that we did was directly with patients. And I really loved that period of time. It was a really kind of special, really, it only lasted about a year in Oregon. But there was a special period of time where we got to interact with a lot of people that were older, that were fighting cancer, fighting different things, and were making their own preparations at home. And dosing was very important. They were trying to be consistent, and they needed things to be potent. And there were several times that I'd come home and just have to cry a little bit because you're just around so much. Like, even though they're going through so much, there's so much positivity still pouring out of a lot of these people, and they have such a good energy. And then eventually you don't see them anymore, and um, it's a really heavy thing, but it's something that I think, especially a lot of us that have been a part of the medical cannabis programs in one form or another. It's in I don't know. It's like it's a it's something I feel very humbled to have experienced, because now that the cannabis industry is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, a lot of the stories and a lot of that side of things, it just feels a little diluted. Like, you don't hear about it as much or see it quite as much. There's a lot of other talk and marketing and stuff going on, and so it's nice to I think really important to stop and remember those things, and how cannabis has affected people in very serious ways. And that's why, once again, I'm so stoked that Wham is coming back. That's so cool.
Yeah, we're very excited about it. And, honestly, one of the most important things about WHAM is that, it wasn't just the cannabis, it was the community that it
Yeah.
created. And so
Hmm.
you have a social safety net, you have people who can help you through tough times, and even little things like at a WHAM meeting, somebody would stand up and be like, I need help moving this weekend. Does anybody have a pickup
Yeah.
truck? And just that kind of community support. And working in the garden and seeing the plants grow and tending to them, that really became therapeutic in its own right.
Yep.
It really helps people taking a hand in making their own medicine.
And what are your thoughts now, looking at how the cannabis industry has evolved? Um, kind of what's your perspective there? Are you relatively pleased with how things seem to be transpiring, or do you have some things that you kind of hope to see change or evolve?
Yeah, and what I like to say is that, legalization is not an event, it's a process, and we're
Yeah.
still at the very
Hmm.
beginning of this process. Is it ideal how it's rolled out in California? No, I think there's a lot of equity issues that we have to work
Hmm.
on. There's a lot of tax issues that we have to work on. There's a lot of things that need to be done to support patients and compassionate care and not let that fall by the wayside. And I think it's very important to amplify those businesses that are rooted in the medical marijuana movement and that do still care about taking care of patients. Um, but yeah, I think we have a lot of work to do. I think national legalization is obviously the next step,
Hmm.
and getting honestly, a lot of the really boring things I ironed out, like things like banking, things like the
Yeah,
ability
yeah,
of small businesses to get loans. Because right now you have to be either privately funded by wealthy individuals or you have to seek venture capital. And it makes it really, really hard for small businesses to grow.
yeah.
So we need to make sure that more people can get into the industry and then it's not just restricted to people who are already very wealthy.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and in my mind, it's one of those things where time is really of the essence because as the industry continues to grow and evolve, and as these different companies get established, um, the playing field starts to change even more, and you get consolidations of businesses and stuff. And so, particularly the equity piece, it's something that I've talked about several times on the podcast, but something that I really urge people to think about urgently because that becomes a harder situation to deal with the more that time goes on, because you have an industry, a market that is maturing and finding its feet, and companies that are, really starting to come into their own and start to kind of solidly take part of the market. So it's those are things that have been on my mind too. And as far as the edibles side of things go, what do you think we can expect from the next couple of years, 3 or 4 years, of the edibles industry as it matures and evolves? Do you foresee certain types of products maybe on the horizon that might become popular, or and we've already talked about drinks and things like that, so maybe we've already hit it, but where do you see the edibles market going in the next couple of years?
Well, previous to the whole pandemic situation,
Yeah.
if I can take us back to that wonderful time of last year.
Right. Can anyone remember?
Yeah, if you had asked me this question last year, I would have said restaurants are the new frontier. And
Yeah.
being able to get that kind of stuff regulated and permitted and sort out the details of how we can actually serve infused food to people in a restaurant setting, and or be able to allow cannabis smoking in like an outdoor patio type of like restaurant
Yeah.
setting. And there were some pioneers who were starting to work on that. There was the OG Cannabis Cafe in LA.
Mhm.
There are a lot of underground supper clubs that were doing really wonderful work in normalizing cannabis hospitality. And obviously now that's all taken a back seat, with
Mhm.
what's going on. But hopefully at some point when we're able to realize that vision, that's really what I think is going to be happening. Hopefully, in 5 years, we'll have, um, just like every restaurant that's successful needs to have a liquor license. I want to be able to give people alternatives where they can go and smoke a joint before their appetizer shows up and have that be acceptable in a social
Yeah.
setting. I really would like to see um, the the monopoly of alcohol on our socialization.
Mhm.
I would like to see that go away, and I would love to see like an Amsterdam type, you know, situation where there's consumption lounges, there's safe places where you can sit and smoke a joint and order a coffee or even a full meal.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think too, going back to the medical stuff again, there are some people that, depending on medications they're taking, if they're going through radiation treatments or whatever, um, that may want to go out with friends. They struggle with appetite, and being able to get a quick dose of cannabinoids in the system to stimulate that appetite so that they can even enjoy being at the restaurant. um, that would help a lot of people that are in situations like that where they're not trying to bring attention to themselves. They're not all they need is just a designated safe place to be able to, whether it's smoking or vaping, whatever they need to do, and then be able to enjoy the food. So there's that aspect too that I think is important for people to consider when thinking about, um, whether it be valuable to pursue doing something like that. It's examples like that come to my mind all the time.
Exactly. And yeah, cannabis has been proven to make food smell and taste better for anyone. And that's basically what the munchies are.
Yeah.
So whether you need to stimulate your appetite due to a medical concern, or whether you want to heighten that experience by having a couple puffs, it behooves the restaurant, honestly, because you're likely to order a lot
Right.
more.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, we've noticed that our average tables have started
Yeah.
spending 20% more than they used to. Yeah, it's excellent point. And I see we've been going here for almost an hour, so I'll start to wrap things up here. But it's been great being able to talk to you about all of the stuff. I've learned a little bit, and I'm sure people listening have learned a ton. At the end of my conversations, I like to essentially hand the platform over to you. If there's any sort of last words you want to throw in, or any topics we haven't gotten into that you think would be valuable to get into, I've definitely got the time and willing to do that. Otherwise, let people know how to learn more about the Satori line and CannaCraft and your own work, and the books that you've authored, and all the stuff. The podcast is now yours to do with as you wish.
Thank you.
Totally.
Yeah, something that I'm very excited about that we've been working on for the past 6 months is using the chocolate as an ingredient in recipes.
Mm-hmm.
And so, speaking of a lot of my friends who are cannabis chefs who were previously running supper clubs, and their businesses are now permanently on hold, we approached many of these leading chefs in the cannabis culinary movement and tasked them with using the Satori chocolate in a dessert recipe. And it's a fun, easy way to dose homemade edibles at home, make some really decadent desserts. And so all of those recipes are up at satorichocolates.com. And we really want to align with home cooks and people in the cannabis culinary movement and push that agenda forward and teach people new and interesting ways to melt the chocolate and make some cupcakes, or make a tiramisu,
Yes.
or make some pudding, whatever you want to make with cannabis chocolate. We're there for you. And follow us on Instagram at Satori Chocolates, Twitter, Facebook. We're all over the place. And we want to hear from people, and we're going to be working on some new products. They're going to come out through the fall and winter, and we'll give you more details when that develops.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds good. I'll be following all of the different stuff CannaCraft does anyway, but I'll be keeping an eye on specifically on the Satori stuff, and see what fun stuff you have in store. It'll be cool. And everyone listening, if you want to learn more about Curious About Cannabis, you can go to cacpodcast.com. You can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, mostly on Instagram. I always tell people that's the main place we actually update things. But thanks so much for tuning in. And once again, Elise, I appreciate you being willing to give me the past hour. It was really fun getting to dive into all of this stuff. Thanks, the listeners, for tuning in for the hour. Stay curious and take it easy. Bye-bye. If you want to learn more about cannabis, check out the Curious About Cannabis book on Amazon.com and other major online book retailers.